Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the history of India from 1750s to 1857, we talked about the land revenue settlements in one of the earlier lectures, and now we will continue about the land revenue settlements. We were discussing about the permanent settlement in the previous lecture. We talked about the various kinds of provisions which were there, the part of the land revenue settlement, especially in the context of the permanent settlement, and how the idea of property was introduced through the permanent settlement which was there. The assessment was done forever, and how we find that the zamindars, they were being made the proprietors of the land, and how rayats, they were at the receiving end of the policy which was followed by the British. We also see that the kind of regulations which came in 1799, how the zamindars, the power of the zamindars, it got increased, and any kind of redress against the unjust distress and the sale of property was provided by an appeal to the civil court. But because of which we find that the large number of cases they accumulated in the courts, and because of the increased litigation, we find that zamindars, they were at an end where they were reaping the kind of rewards, because the rayats, they did not have the resources to fight the battle in the courts. So that way we find that any kind of laws which came, they were in favor of the zamindars and not for the rayats. And at the same time we find that the various kinds of laws which were being made by the British, where the sunset law was in a way favorable to the British in terms of collection of revenue, and how the zamindar, he had to pay the land revenue on time by a particular date, and the rayats, they had no particular kind of a protection against the kind of regulations which were made by the British in the permanent settlement. And we find that the position of the tenants, it in relation to the landlords, it weakened, and the courts, they faced basically an unprecedented increase in litigation. So all these kinds of things, they were happening in the context of the impact of the permanent settlement, and the kind of relationships of trust and faith which were there in the earlier times, they also broke. We also find that how when the private property in the form of land was introduced, then how these people, they could also invest, the native moneyed classes, they could invest their money or their capital in terms of purchasing the land. So land basically became some sort of a means of investing the capital, and this resulted in a large scale transfer of the landed property. So because of which we find that when large scale transfer of landed property was taking place, then the value of the land, it also increased, and the earlier ideas which were associated with the land, that how land was not a sellable commodity, and how land was seen to be the ideas of motherland, how land was equated with mother. These were the traditional ideas of the villagers or the peasant community. But with the introduction of the various land settlements, we find that land was basically made some sort of a sellable commodity, and how the British, they wanted to secure a fixed income, and how they wanted to secure some kind of support of the zamindars, and at the same time they wanted that new methods of cultivation, they would be introduced, and when these new methods, they would be introduced by the zamindars, then it would create some kind of a contented and resourceful peasantry. But when we tend to understand it, then understand the impact, then we find that this kind of a thing did not take place, and the idea that permanent settlement would in a way encourage the agricultural enterprise and prosperity could not happen. In the context of the administration, we find that the able servants of the East India Company, they were made free for the judicial services and for the other kinds of reforms. So because now they will not be engaged in the conduct of the permanent settlement, because for that they had the zamindars, and they also felt that zamindars, they would act as the natural leaders to the Rayat, and they will also engage themselves in education and other kinds of activities. So, when these were some of the advantages which occurred for the British, and when we tend to understand the disadvantages, we find that it created some kind of a feudalism at the top and serfdom at the bottom, and the sub-infeudation, it reached ridiculous proportions, and absentee landlordism could be seen, and the peasantry also suffered. So, if we tend to understand in terms of disadvantages, we find that it retarded the economic progress of Bengal, and no interest in the improvement of land was shown during this period. So, it was these were some of the problems which were there with regard to the permanent settlement, the way it was being introduced, and how peasantry suffered because of this settlement which was being done. And we find that after the permanent settlement in Bengal, the British, they also introduced the Rayatwari settlement, and when we talk about the Rayatwari settlement, the objective of the Rayatwari settlement when it was being introduced, that how some kind of a system where they could have some kind of a contract with the Rayats on a direct basis, where there was no need for any kind of an intermediary, that zamindar was not needed, and some kind of a contract with the Rayats would be taken up, so that some kind of a benefit to the Rayats could occur. And this we find in the Madras Presidency, and we find that how it was in a way started by Alexander Reed in 1792 in Baramahal, and how Thomas Munro, he continued the settlement from 1802 onwards. And when we tend to understand the Rayatwari settlement, we see that how the money was to be collected directly from the village, how fixing the amount was done which each village had to pay, and after this they proceeded to assess each cultivator or Rayat separately, and thus evolved the Rayatwari settlement. So, it created the kind of individual proprietary right in land, but it was vested in peasants rather than in the zamindars. So, we find that the idea behind the introduction of the Rayatwari settlement was to have a contract with the peasants, to in a way the proprietary right was to be granted to them and not to the zamindars, and the zamindars as intermediaries, they should not be involved in the Rayatwari settlement. But when we tend to understand the Rayatwari settlement, we find that the people, those who were the elite section, the people those who were tied to the land in some kind of a dominant capacity, they were not totally eliminated even in the Rayatwari settlement as well. And the people, those who were interested in that context, that the way they wanted to they wanted to initiate the Rayatwari settlement in these areas, especially Madras, Munro was the main person who was responsible, and the way he wanted that the settlement should be with more than 40 to 50,000 people, and who are the small proprietors rather than the 400 or 500 great ones. And David Ludden, he says that it defined the state itself as the supreme landlord, and individual peasant landowners who obtained title by paying the annual cash rents or revenue assessments to the government. So, in a way, state became the supreme landlord, and the role of intermediary of the zamindars, it was done away with, and the peasants, they had to obtain the title by paying the annual cash to the state or the government. So, we find that when we tend to understand the Rayatwari settlement, it required a lot of some sort of a detailed land survey, and the quality of the soil and the area of the field and the average produce of every piece of land had to be assessed, and on basis of that amount of revenue was to be fixed. Sir, but what actually happens is that all these kinds of things which were there in theory, they could not be implemented in the practical aspects, and many a times we find that the land revenue was arbitrarily fixed. So this kind of an idea where you have to have a detailed land survey where all the aspects of the land they will be examined, and thereafter you will have some kind of a revenue settlement or amount of revenue which was to be fixed. But in the practical sphere, when we try to understand it, we find that this thing was not done the way it was being anticipated, and many a times it was more arbitrary in nature, and many a times we also find that it was more of a guesswork, and because of this guesswork we find that over assessment was a big concern during this period. And we find that how peasants, they were the people, those who were suffering because of the unjust settlements which were there, and this was almost abandoned when Munro left for London in 1807, and thereafter when he returns to India as the governor of Madras, he argued that Raiyatwari was an ancient Indian land tenure system, and it was the best suited to the Indian conditions. And he also believed that the British Empire needed a unified concept of sovereignty, and Raiyatwari system could provide a foundation for that. So the ideas of Thomas Munro, when he comes back to India as governor, when he is there as governor of Madras, and when he says that he made some kind of a reference that how it was also in the interest of the empire, the British Empire, and he in a way argued that Indian land tenure systems, they were also designed that way, and Indian conditions, they also in a way demanded that such kind of a system should be introduced, and British, they will also have some kind of a unified concept of sovereignty when this system would be introduced. And we find that Munro argues that historically land in India was owned by the state, and which collected the revenue from the individual peasants through a hierarchy of officials spread through the grant of Inam land. So the people, those who were associated with the introduction of the Raiyatwari settlement, they argued, or they tried to in a way point out that how it would be beneficial for the Indians as well. But if we try to see the concern of these officials, we find that Munro was well respected in the circles where he was functioning, and he might have that kind of a an idea where he wanted to provide some kind of a relief to the agriculturalist or the direct producers. But we find that when these kinds of settlements, when they were being initiated, when they were contracted with the Raiyats were not able to secure the kind of benefits because the assessment was always very high, and the way they were able to collect the land revenue despite the vagaries of nature, how many times we find that famines and the crop failures, such kind of a situation emerged, but the Raiyats, they could not get the kind of support which they would have received at different times. So Munro argues that the Raiyatwari settlement would in a way reduce the revenue burden for the farmers, while it would yield larger amount of land revenue for the state, as no intermediaries would be having a share of the surplus. So that was his idea, and London was also happy in that context. British government settled in Britain was happy, as the system would place authority and power directly in the British hands in a way which Cornwallis system would never hope to achieve. So we find that the British government was also happy with this kind of a situation, where the East India Company in India would be directly dealing with the Raiyats, where the authority and the power will come to the British in a way which was not possible in the system which was introduced by Cornwallis in Bengal. So they were happy with this kind of a situation, where they will have more authority and more power for themselves. And when we tend to understand the Rayatwari settlement, we also find that the cultivating peasants, they became impoverished over a period of time, and largely they were indebted, and they could not invest for the extension of cultivation. So the idea that the peasants, when they will be proprietors of their own land, they will invest their money, and the extension in agriculture would also take place, but that actually does not take place in the long run. And the idea that surveys will be conducted, that also does not happen during that time, and many times the assessment was on arbitrary basis. And definitely we find that the Rayatwari settlement, it increased the income of the government, but the cultivators, they were put at a great distress because of the high revenue demand which was there during this time. And we also find that how many times the idea was to eliminate the intermediaries, but it did not take place, that how intermediaries, they could not be eliminated, and how the people, those who were considered as elites, they were part of this system. And as privileged rents and the special rights of the Mirasidars, they were recognized, and the caste privileges of the Brahmins, they were respected. The existing village power structure was hardly altered, and indeed even more strengthened by the new system. So we find that the kinds of ideas which were there, that how these things they will change, but actually such kind of thing did not happen. And the people, those who were known as the Mirasidars, those who were the big landowners, their special rights, they were even recognized in it. And we find that this kind of a system whereby the power also increased, this enhancement of power which took place in the context of the revenue officials, then the coercion, bribery and the corruption, it also increased. And this was reflected in the Madras Torture Commission report in 1855, that how the officials, those who had increased power, they were in a way exploiting the rayats. And when we tend to understand the kind of impact which the Rayatwari settlement had on the agrarian society, we find that the scholars, they have some kind of a divided opinion regarding this. And Neil Charlesworth, he does not think that the Wingate settlements actually introduced between 1840 and 70 caused any dramatic changes in Western India. And though he talks about the reduced kind of status of the Patil, and on the other hand, historians like Ravindra Kumar and Sumit Guha, they have argued that Rayatwari settlements, they brought about a lot of social upheaval in the society, and impact was also long term, and how the authority of the village headman, it reduced, and it brought some kind of a status evolution in Maharashtra villages, and how this kind of a situation, it ultimately led to the Deccan peasant uprising in 1875. And if we tend to understand the Deccan peasant uprising, which we find that it was as a result of the eviction of the peasants, how peasants, they were in a way evicted from their holdings, and how they were being in a way exploited by the moneylenders, how they took money from the moneylenders, and these moneylenders who were very adept in terms of doing all sorts of fraud and treachery. And the people, those who took loans, when they signed their papers or when they put their thumb on the papers, they did not even know what was being written on the papers, and many times they put their thumbs on the papers on which nothing was written, and then these moneylenders, they manipulated those papers for their own benefit. And we find that this kind of a uprising in 1875 was directed towards the Mahajans or the moneylenders, and how the account books, they were being destroyed during this time. So, when we tend to understand Rayatwari settlement, we find that how hereditary zamindars they were being done away with, and how a specific sum of money as a maximum revenue was to be paid. And we find that in 1817 a modified version of the Rayatwari settlement it was being introduced, which was different from the old Rayatwari settlement, and where you will find that the existence of the various rights of in property were recognized in terms of how mirasdars they were being given these kinds of rights, and some kind of variants of the Rayatwari settlement in Western India they were also being introduced. And we find Elphinstone, he settled tax on villages on a whole instead of the individual peasants. R.K. Pringley, he conducted a survey in 3 stages of taluka of Indapur, we find, and in the stages the various kinds of surveys which were conducted by him in this particular taluka, and thereafter in this survey the holdings of the Rayats they were being measured, and fields they were being classified, and rent was fixed at 55%, but this was not a fixed it was this settlement was a short lived settlement, as work was very expensive and staff was not all that trained, it was lacking in any kind of experience. So these were some kind of limitations when we see in that sense, and when you tend to understand the Rayatwari settlement, we find that the people those who were engaged in land they were also varied, and the people those who took to agriculture during the season, and how at different points of time they were also engaged in other kinds of activities. When we tend to understand the Rayatwari settlement, we find that how people those who were farmers and those who were the payers of revenue, these people they were engaged in the Rayatwari settlement, and the survey and the measurement, all this was a very stupendous task, and the classification of soil in itself it was also a big task which was to be undertaken. And if we think that it was done in a way of uniform principles or just principles, then it would be very misleading, and many a times we find that this task was hastily performed and it was badly executed. So we find that the Rayatwari settlement in a way weakened the bounds of unison and the solidarity, and the collectivism it gave way to atomization, and the rural indebtedness during this time it gathered or acquired a new dimension, and the institution of the law courts came, and how vanis or the money lenders, those who were providing the money to the people those who were engaged in agriculture, how they in a way flourished at the expense of the Rayats. Apart from the permanent settlement and the Rayatwari settlement, another settlement was the Mahalwari settlement, which was assessed on the revenue of an entire mahal or the fiscal unit, and how the land was divided into mahals. Each mahal it comprised of one or more village, and it was introduced in the central province, northwest frontier, Agra, Punjab, Gangetic Valley, etc. So these were the areas in which Mahalwari settlement was in a way introduced, and it was made with the village community or with the talukdar where he was available. And in addition to the rights of proprietors, the rent was to be paid by the resident who was cultivating peasant, and it was to be ascertained and recorded. So we find that even in the Mahalwari settlement, talukdars they were not completely eliminated, and wherever possible joint proprietary right in land was vested in the village communities. So the ownership rights were vested with the peasants, and village community was held responsible for the collection of the taxes. So when we tend to understand all the land revenue settlements which we have discussed about whether the permanent or Rayatwari or Mahalwari, we find that over assessment was there, and it also led to poverty and famines. Thank you very much.